Greetings Tape Shagger. In this video I'm going to completely deconstruct the Mecha block, that is the transport, the cassette player from this, which is a partly naked Akai MG614 4-track. I believe that apart from the heads, this is the same mechanism as is found in the Akai stereo cassette player, the name of which has suddenly eluded me. I'll put it up on the screen. So if you're refurbishing one of those, this is also going to help. I'll just show you that on this unit I have successfully got this working. So if I press play, the meters are responding, I can stop, I can make it fast forward and rewind, stop and eject. But what you're going to see is that this was very rusty when I first got it open. I made a video diary as I was taking it apart, and because it was complicated I also filmed reconstructing it. So I've done a lot to lubricate it, treat rust inside it. The rust treatment is going to be a separate video, so maybe that's up in the corner of the screen now. The teardown of this unit is going to be in a separate video, and that video will contain very basic information about refurbishing this, like imagining you were lucky enough to have one in better condition and all you really needed to do was change over the one belt that's in there, pinch roller, the idler tyre. Simple instructions like that will be included in that teardown video. This is much more in depth. You know, really deconstructing and cleaning every part of this I possibly can and then putting it back together again. So I'll run the introduction and then you'll see first the footage of me figuring out how to take it apart and talking a little bit about the treatment of the rust, and then by the time I build it back up again, which I think is going to be about the last third of the video, I'll add chapters on YouTube so you can navigate to the bit that's important to you. By that point I'm feeling much more confident about what different things do and where things go. Okay, I'll start to take this apart. Cut this cable tie. Looks like the red cables coming from a play record head, and the grey cables are coming from the erase head to the left here. This plate was situated like so, so that's creating a channel for these wires to go off, and then they would go down that way to the record playback board. As I said earlier, it's unusual to have this arrangement where the heads and the pinch roller are at the top. It's much more usual to have them at the bottom. I'm going to start by trying to take off the bracket on this side. This screw was so rusty I couldn't get it out at all. Some time has elapsed. I've left some oil on there. You can see that it's sort of soaked into the rust here. And I waited for this little brass brush to arrive, so hopefully I can get some of the rust out the ferrule. Scrub some more at this side. Okay, it's coming now. Finally. I think the next thing I want to be able to do is get this plate and this motor off so that I can show you and see for myself just how bad the corrosion is on the direct drive motor under here and the mechanism for the raising and lowering of the heads. So I'm going to try and get 1, 2, 3 screws out. It looks like I've got to take this bracket with this motor on it first, so there's 2 screws for that and 1 here. I'll go off screen. Presumably I'm going to need to use some penetrating oil and the wire brush. Maybe give the end of the screwdriver a good old thump with a rubber mallet in order to get those loose. I'll let you know when I come back. It wasn't actually as bad as I thought. All the screws came out without too much protest. They're all of the same type, but it's not a type that we've seen before. Rounded but not domed in their cap, about 6mm long in total, maybe 4mm long the shaft of them. They're metal to metal screws, so they have a shallow and fine ferrule. I've also cut a cable tie from this corner. That lifts out, it looks like this wheel's coming with it. If I take that wire out of that bracket, this cable's going to come out of this hole here. Looks like the autofocus setting on my camera isn't ideal for this. Okay, I can let that dangle off to the side there. So look at the state of that. If I move this direct drive motor, I can feel something really nasty there. You can see that this side is fairly clear, though there is some rust on it, but this side of it is very, very rusty indeed. This real motor, thick rust all around the metal surfaces. This little motor, if I pull this off, that belt will need to be replaced anyway. I mean, that is turning freely, and it's just the control belt, so it wouldn't contribute to any wow and flutter. It's part of the mechanism that lowers and raises the head, and that won't contribute to wow and flutter, so even if there was some corrosion inside of there, maybe that doesn't matter. This one's so rusty, I have my concerns about that. I'd be more hopeful about hooking up an alternative motor, maybe from a spares 244 or something, than I would this one. This is direct drive, so if this one isn't working, then no dice, we cannot restore this. I'm looking for a way to remove this without desoldering anything. I can't see one. I think I need to remove this metal bracket that has this potentiometer wired to it, and lift up this motor with, it looks like there's 1, 2, 3 screws. 2 of them in shot now, 3rd one in shot now. If I remove those 2, then hopefully all of this will come away. I could get a bit more leeway with the wire for this to dangle off the side by cutting this little cable tie, but I may forget to put that back on if I do that, so I'm just going to leave it on. I'll go off screen and try and remove 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 screws. Those screws also came off without too much protest. The ones that are around the capstan were the same length as the ones we were just looking at. We just compare these in length. Those ones are just under 5mm in total length, whereas these other ones are maybe closer to 7mm. So I'll want to keep those in 2 separate packets. I'm keeping these in little grip lock bags. Having done that, this is still attached somehow, so we'll come back to that. But this comes away now, and the results are interesting and quite encouraging. If I pull on this, out comes this flywheel with the capstan pin in the centre, and there's not much corrosion in there. This will be a fixed magnet, and what it looks like is the armatures that we would tend to find inside, say, a Mabuchi motor are actually located on this board. So this board, you know, has the servo, creates the electromagnet, and then this electromagnet is on a plate which causes this to spin. I presume that's how that's working. But looking at that free, there's no belt to go around to that, so even if I couldn't get that corrosion off, that's not necessarily catastrophic. There is a lot of muck and dirt on this board, but you know, it's pretty open, so I could probably bring that back. It'll be a lot of work, but that's probably salvageable. And the capacitors and whatever kind of, these op amps, not sure. But anyway, whatever these little 9-pin, 8-pin integrated circuits are, these transistors, all of that is going to be pretty fungible. It's stuff I can probably just order online if I needed to, but it may not even be necessary. So I now feel more confident that this might be something we can get back. I'm now going to remove these brackets, one on this side, one on the underneath here. This is how the transport is suspended in the frame of the MG614. I don't believe it's critical to the mechanism beneath. Smaller size of screwdriver here. I've already had to use some penetrating oil, leave it a couple of minutes, and then hit the end of the screwdriver with a rubber mallet to get those free. On this side, closer to the heads, the cap is larger. I already looked at those, so I'll just take them off with my fingers. Let's look at the screws we removed. On the side farthest from the heads, the screws are much smaller and they're much narrower. They're the same length on both sides, and the other ones are of this domed type. The ones that were holding these brackets on were a bit longer, but they are broadly of the same sort. So these ones are just removed. They're under 10mm, where the longer ones are just over 10mm. Let me get that in an angle where you can see that. Like I said at the beginning of the video, this may not be the optimal order in which to do things, but the next step I'm going to try and take is to get this black bracket, which seems to have the door opening mechanism attached to it, off from this base plate that's got the actual mechanical intimers of the transport mechanism on it. So it looks like if I take off 1, 2, and on the other side 2 corresponding, so 3, 4 screws, then this part's going to slide into a hole that's big enough so we can kind of get the bracket off there. If I compare that on the other side, there's the other hole, so there's tape here I could just peel off. So I'm guessing that with those 4 screws off, then that's just going to slide off and I can get the door mechanism away from the rest of the transport. Okay, so I've taken those 2 screws off and I can already feel the force of the springs wanting to push this all to pieces, so I'm filming it. Feels like a pin just came out of there. I've got a spring going from hook here. One end of that spring was on this arm here, and the others was hooking in to this piece of plastic here. I wonder if I turn this over, one pin just came out of there, and this pin that's on this bracket went into that hole there. So that door mechanism is now free. The other 2 screws have been taken off now. The screws are of the same kind that were removed from these places that were keeping that board for the direct drive motor in place. So quite narrow, metal to metal, shallow, narrow ferrule, smaller size of screwdriver, and that's the length of them, just over 5mm in total. This is the plate I just removed. Notice that on this side and on this side, little plastic grooved grommets, like plastic parts with a groove in there. Is that visible in the camera? It looks like they go in there and then slide along here, so there's some pretty old nasty grease on there that I would want to replace, but it looks like how that's interfacing with these pins. So these pins go inside there and then slide along these paths. This is complicated enough. I probably will film the reconstruction of it as well, so don't worry if you didn't get that immediately. Yeah, look at the door itself. Not too much to it. Not sure how that. I think we could just pull that, yeah, off there. That's metal. This is plastic, so the metal's got enough give in it. We can just slide it back over these pins if that came off. And on the other side, get that at an angle, you can see that. That's it. This one, there's quite a bit more going on. So there's a mechanism here that's very stiff. There's obviously some very old grease on there. This is presumably the spring to do with the door mechanism, so that was in the second most of those 2 holes at that end. Looks like this is held on with a C-clip. You can use a really small diameter flathead screwdriver to get into the space here to pull these off. Actually, that's maybe not quite sharp enough for that. Normally those little 2 spaces, you can drive something like that in and pull them off that way. Yeah, that's just really old nasty grease on there. I'll give you a rough idea of that C-clip size. I guess that's maybe 4mm total diameter. And then this switch, I'll detach that from there as well. And they came up easily enough, so that wants to go there like that when it goes back, so that the part with the switch on it is above this square recess here, well, oblong recess. And it seems that just by lifting these 2 clips, it's going to slide out. Now, a little bit short of space here. Yeah, it does come out easily enough. How would that go back in? I just guess, yeah, you just got to sort of turn it at an angle. Yeah, it looks like that corner there's interfacing with this clip, so it's got to go into that space there on the way back in, and that's that off. It looks like if I remove 1, 2, 3 screws, That corresponds to 1, 2, 3 posts here, like the screws are going into them from the far side. And at that point, this part may come away, which is what I want, to be able to get this off. I've loosened these off. This one that I'm taking out by thumb and forefinger just now needed a bit of penetrating oil. This one's got a common ground connector, ring connectors at both ends, which will be joining this part with the head array on it to the chassis, and the chassis will be connected to circuit ground by some other method, I suppose. Let's get that out. Screws the same length. Also the same length of screw. Okay, let's come away finally. Alright. I suppose another way to have done it would have been to desolder these wires or these, but I tend to unscrew things rather than desolder things if I possibly can. The screws I just removed, just very slightly shorter than these more numerous ones, but they're a little bit longer than the ones that I removed from these 4 places. So it looks like I need another little plastic bag for this medium length, which is maybe 7mm length in total. The more I'm handling this, the looser this is becoming, and I think that might be part of how the door opens as well, because this unit was powering on, the mixer worked, but absolutely no response from the eject mechanism or anything like that. I'll go away and see if I can get things to move. See that is turning a bit, which it wasn't before, loose against this place that it wasn't before, like, so clearly those screws that I removed earlier were holding that against there. I'll come back. Several days have elapsed, and as you can probably see, I have made some significant inroads into refurbishing this. Probably the most noticeable part is this flywheel no longer has any rust on it. I mean, you can see where the rust was, there's this sort of mottled discolouring. But I just want to talk about a suggested order for taking this apart. There's stuff I've taken apart here which for normal servicing I don't think you would have to. Let's imagine that this was still attached to the bracket with, you know, this part underneath. I think once you've got those black brackets that attach the door off, and once you've removed this bracket with this little motor on it, which will have this plastic wheel and a belt connecting this, the end of this, to the pulley on the motor. What you could then do is remove the 3 screws in these locations, and this whole thing would come off as a unit, and that would allow you to get grease or lubricant onto this little gear that's on this potentiometer, this gear, and get this clip off and get that off, completely lubricate it. We've probably got enough access to this little rocker arm here and to this mechanism, which definitely is opening the door, but I think it might actually be raising and lowering heads at the same time. I think the nature of this design, where the heads are at the top of the cassette cavity, probably means that closing the door and inserting the heads inside the cassette shell are the same movement, or at least that's my thoughts at the moment. Under most circumstances, any further disassembly of this wouldn't be all that necessary, but let's run through some of that again. Here, remember, we removed 3 screws. This before was very rusty, but there was also some writing on it, you know, it said Akai and everything. What I've done is I've taken some sort of premium motor oil. I'm using AMS oil. It's the 0W/30, so it's like a very thin viscous oil, and I found that by putting that on in combination with quite high grit wet dry sandpaper, I was able to get the build-up of nastiness, oxidization. I don't know what the white stuff that were on these mottled metal parts underneath was called, but I was able to get that off that way as well. I used an old scalpel to get into some nooks and crannies. I did do some work with this little metal brush, but I didn't do that much with it, to be honest. It was mostly the sandpaper and the scalpel. But anyway, that's how that surface is now clear. So if for some reason you wanted to get this stuff off, you know, take that wire out of there. There's going to be 1, 2, 3 of these screws. I've only got one in at the moment. So that plate's going to come off with this PCB attached. If you want to take the PCB off, it's got 4 screws from this side. 1, 2, 3, 4. When you put that back on, the screw heads are coming in from this side, and the plastic part here just clips in like that. That stops this flywheel with this fixed magnet in it from jumping up to the plate. Look at this. It's very magnetic. And then these spaces are for this group of 4 resistors and this group of 2 resistors, and so you would put your 4 screws back in here, okay? If you needed to polish this plate or something, as I did, you can also remove these 3 screws. That gives you access to that metal surface. I tried taking these 3 screws out, but I don't know if it's erosion, corrosion here, but this part didn't seem to want to come away from that plate, but since I've been able to clear up the corrosion around it, it doesn't seem very important to me. This, if you'll remember, had a thick, white, dusty looking covering on it. I completely disassembled that, and then it was mostly getting into here with just scraping the goo off, because basically, I mean, actually you can still see some of it just in... I haven't completely cleared it off, but I don't think it's that important. It became this chalky goo once the oil was on there. So I got that off, and that means that this rocker arm here, which I think was connected to the bit that opened the cassette door, I think this is there's a little metal leg, so at different points this is going to go down or come up, and so maybe that's pushing a switch. We'll figure that out later. But you could access here, so you probably want some machine oil in there, something like, I forget, between lithium grease and silicon grease. I think it's lithium grease is suitable for metal to plastic connections. I mean, in fact, you could use either. I don't think anything catastrophic is going to happen. So you could get that in there so that moves freely. Some sort of grease in here on this cog. Well, you probably put it on this one, actually, that's going round. And then if it gets in the teeth, then it's going to get into the teeth of this internal part. We'll see that more clearly in a minute. So getting this off, what we need to begin with is this metal clip. I think that's called a horseshoe clip, I'm not sure. It's something I've seen before in pictures of contraptions, but I've never actually encountered one on a Porta Studio before. It's very stiff compared to an E-clip. I had to work it off with a pair of flathead screwdrivers. I wonder if I can reproduce that step just now. Let's find out. Basically, there's a groove there, and there's protrusions just beside these 2 little holes. They're going deep into that. So if I sort of pry that out, and then quite often my videos are edited to make them as short as possible, but maybe we should just leave this in to show you how difficult and time consuming this is to get off, or it was for me the first time I tried to do it. There may be an efficient way to do this and I just don't know it. Okay, so I've sort of got that up and out of the shaft and of the groove, so that's just gone back in. So I found the trick was to do that on both sides, and then you can sort of like shimmy it up here and it comes off. Okay. Maybe if I leave that in there. Okay, so it's out the groove now, and what I can do is just slowly bring it up here. At this point, if I give it a wiggle, it comes off. So yeah, you can see that is not very easy to take off. So then you could get in there, give that a really good clean. I mean, I've cleaned that a bit. There's still some kind of the old black grease in there, so I maybe need to clean that some more. Now, I suspect that when you put that back on, and in a way I would say if you don't need to, don't take this out, the position of this arm and how far rotated this pot are very important, because I'm sure, and the reason I'm sure is because it's such a similar mechanism in a way to the control mechanism in a Tascam 244. I'm sure that is actually critical to the signals that the logic boards receive. We'll look at the service manual later. Maybe it says how far its range this pot should be when that's inserted. Let's say you needed to get these rocker arms off. Again, we're using a different kind of clip to what I'm used to seeing. I would normally see like a C-clip or something in this application, but I think I was getting the curved prong of these tweezers and just lifting these metal parts out the little groove that they're on. See, I haven't put them back in completely solidly. The reason I dislike these compared to a C-clip is because you misshape them when you take them off, and so they're not as tight a fit when you put them back on. I'll probably need to do some work, you know, push these tabs right down into the little groove that's on these pins that keep them in place. But, you know, you could lift these up and then that'll come up. And this already feels quite stuck again, but yeah, that fits on there. This little clip, you see there's a little screw for it there, I think that fit round the plastic parts. On the door mechanism, I don't have that handy, but hopefully you can remember the bit I mean. So you could get that out, and if you want to get this off, then you first remove these 4 screws. Remember, these were a slightly different length to the other ones that look like them. And with those 4 screws out, then that would lift off, meaning that you could get corrosion off the surface if it had that. Mine certainly did. That just pops off now. Come on. So you could clean that. You've then got access to that washer. You could use pliers to unscrew that. I find it slightly easier to use a socket set to get it loose. That then comes off there. If you thought that was dirty, and I did think that this was dirty, you can pry off these 4 pins. That gives you better access to the actual mechanism within. Actually, you can see I haven't quite bent back that pin properly. Doing this is just a matter of kind of gripping it with serrated, what will we say, arm, a serrated arm pliers. So I'll just bend that back a little bit more. I mean, it shouldn't matter. I mean, it is tight. Okay, so that's how all of that comes apart. I've been able to obtain the service manual for the 614 without too much trouble. I've printed out a couple of pages here which are to do with this mechanism. They're calling it volume control. I'd need to check whether it's actually volume or actually controlling a resistance, which is controlling a voltage which is read by the control boards, which is what I was assuming. But in any case, there are specific instructions for how this should go back together if you have dismantled it. Before I try and summarise those, it is recommending a molybdenum coating for the lubrication of these plastic parts. I had to look that up, and so the black grease that was on there, that's what that was. I'm probably murdering the pronunciation of this, but molybdenum is a metal and it's blackish in colour when it's in a powder which is suspended in a lithium base, and it seems that that is used in quite sort of high temperature, high pressure situations. For instance, truck mechanics. Not the mechanics themselves, I mean the mechanical parts of trucks, but they seem to be recommending that for some of the moving parts here. I don't have any in. I've ordered some. I assume that the Moly is the prefix for the brand Molycoat. I have some Molycoat here, but it's white in colour, so I don't think it actually contains any molybdenum. I assume that Molycoat will have branched out into making other kinds of lubricant, and that's what I have. So I'll have some of that coming in, and you know, it's £3 for a tiny little jar, sort of the same size as that, so good thing to have, I guess. I'll point out where that stuff would be going, although I won't be applying it at this point. So first of all, you've attached the pot to this plate, and then you've put this cog, this slot onto there, and then you've reattached this plate to here. I've only got 1 screw in there, but you know, there's the 4 of them, okay? So at that point, the next thing you want to do, here beside my thumb, you see if I turn this through its entire range of motion, there's only one point where this plastic line down the centre of there, you see that, is going to line up with this little indent in the hole. That's where you want it to be. Then this part, and before you put this in, you put your molybdenum coating on this shaft here. You also want to put it inside the swirly bit that I was saying for the door opening mechanism before, and you also want to put it on these indents. Okay, so 3 places. 1, 2, 3. Okay, so assuming that coating is there, then this way up, can you see that there is a little block shaped bit with an arrow there? Just beside my right fingernail. You want that to line up with this indent on the corner of this plate. Then all the relationships between this cog and this cog are in the right place. Okay. After fitting that, and I'm not going to do it just now because I'm waiting for this molybdenum to arrive, you would put that back on. And with that secure, you could turn that over and put this rocker arm back in. You want that little metal pole there to go into the groove that would be full of the molybdenum paste. You could put that there, and you push your clip on and make sure that that was down solid, and then you would put that into that space, put that clip on, make sure that that was connecting to there solidly, and then when you reconnected this so that this clip here joins to the black plastic protrusion on the door mechanism, you want this post to be between these 2 markers. See, there are little indents on this, so you want that to be in that position, and then that should all slide together nicely. I will have the manual up on the blog, so if you want to read what I've just said in a much more laborious way, then you could follow those instructions instead, but that's roughly what it says. I've taken some time to get rid of most of the rust on this front part of the transport. Don't worry, I'm going to show you how this comes apart and goes back together again, but hopefully you can see that that's got a lot less corrosion on it than the last time it was on screen. Here are the other 2 motors. They're looking not too bad either, and the only bit so far that has seemed really unsalvageable is there's this sort of metal casing around this real motor, and that's really crusty. I think I'm going to have to throw that out. I might have tried to salvage it, except I do have these metal wraps from other motors that I can put around there. I'm not exactly sure what function these serve. Possibly it's shielding so that the heads don't pick up any field that's being generated by the motor. I can't think that they would have put that on there for no reason, so I'll just take those 2 bits of shielding from old Mabuchi motors, and hopefully that'll do the trick. I've had a shot at taking this apart and putting it back together again, so I feel confident enough to demonstrate that. I will take it completely apart just in case you need to do that for lubrication reasons, exposure to damp or something like that. Presuming that most of these are going to be better maintained than the one that I received, the most likely thing you'd need to do under here is clean or replace the idler tyre or the pinch roller. So let's deal with that first. They're both pretty easy to access. They've got these little E-clips, C-clips, depending what you call them. You just put something into that space, pull upwards. They do tend to flick off. Where's that gone? Over there. It's fallen on the surface there. There's a little washer under there. And then the pinch roller comes off. I've already cleaned that with Rubber Renew and it seems to be in pretty good condition. Similar thing with the idler tyre here. It's a little bit more complicated, more parts. Once I get this clip off, again, there is a washer under there. Let me just get that out of the way first. But this is kind of spring loaded, so watch none of this pings away. Because there's this plate. It has these 2 little recesses that match up with 2 pins on the idler wheel, and then there's a spring in the centre of that. Okay, so 4 parts on top. If we turn these parts, I've got enough space to lift this up. Come on. There we go. So these grooved surfaces should be underneath against this piece of felt there. From there, imagining this needed to be treated, I've already treated it with MG Chemicals Rubber Renew. There's other things you could do. Just if it's just dirty, probably just washing up detergent and then dry it off with a clean cloth would be fine. But you see there's a little space there, so you could get something like a pair of tweezers in there to pry that off. I won't do that. I'm finding it useful to group these components into little bags, so I'll have one little bag for all these bits and pieces and another one for these three parts to do the pinch roller, like so. And then if you've got a tray or something, you could lay these out left to right in roughly the order that you're removing them, and then when you're rebuilding the unit, then you just put them back on in reverse order. Just because it's going to allow this base plate to sit a bit flatter on this surface, I'm going to remove the real motor and the record enable switch. Since I've got it this way up, I'll just remove these two screws here that are attaching this plate that has the switch on it. Here's what those screws look like. They were going into plastic, so the ferrules are further apart. So I moved that ruler up so you can see that to scale a bit better. Now that I do have the service manual and will be sharing it, actually the types of screw are very well described in that manual. It's quite a nicely laid out service manual. If you're wondering what all this stuff is, I've just cut my hand on the metal rule. I'll pop the blood before we go on. Anyway, with those screws removed, that's going to come off. You can see there are recesses where these two black plastic pins fit into the plate. So that little switch is being shut by this rocker arm that's detecting whether the record protect tab on the cassette shell has been broken out. I mean, we may as well take this out now as well. There's just plastic clips keeping this sort of metal thing in there, so that's how that's rotating. That comes off there as well. So I might put all of those things together into one plastic bag, like so. You could remove that as well if you wished. Don't see why that would ever be necessary, but if you do remove it, it's going into, if you're looking at it that way up, the leftmost of these three recesses. The switch is all wired into this connector, which is also connected to these two photo sensors. And the way this is working is these, what would we call those, armatures, wings, I don't know. Anyway, these sticky out bits on the take-up reel. The take-up reel and the supply reel are identical, by the way, but they're breaking an LED light that's shining on a photo sensor on the other side of these. So the light's going on and off, on and off, on and off. That information is being sent over to the counter. So that's how this particular system is keeping track of how much the tape is rotated. The upper one of these is held in with two screws. The screws are like this. They're going into metal, so shallower angle to the ferrule. The ferrules are closer together. It's about 7mm long in total, the screw. Take the other one off. At that point, this one of the sensors will lift off. This one's held on with a couple of plastic clips. So if I just pull those back, this little PCB should just lift out. Oh, I'm stuck on the wing of this. There we go. It's just got the LED and the sensor built into one little contraption there. At that point, this entire harness with the record enable switch and the sensors and this connector are all in one thing, so I'll put those and the screws that attached it into one bag. The reason I took this off before the motor is if I took the motor off first, then the weight of this might have bent the little leaf switch there. So if you're going to remove the motor, I would say remove this first. Both the real motor and the control motor share the same connector here, so that's why this is dangling off to the side. The rear motor is attached from this side via 2 screws. This is what the screws look like. They require a fairly small screwdriver to take them out. They're going into metal, so the ferrules are closer together. They're about 8 or 9 millimeters long. So I'll keep them together in one little plastic bag. I'll put that in a larger plastic bag together with these 2 motors, this bracket and this connector. With those electrical parts removed, this is now going to sit a bit more flat. I'm going to begin by removing this plate with magnetic heads on it from the rest of the unit, so we can get at anything else under here that we might need to lubricate. There's a screw here that's holding on this plate, that plate in this little recess where I'm tapping, that has a ball bearing in it in lubricant, and that's the main thing that's keeping this from popping up. I'll lift that up. There's the little ball bearing. I added some moly coat, the white moly coat, not the black moly coat that I'm waiting for. Maybe that would be better stuff to use for that, but I have used this kind of, what do they call it? Yeah, EM30L, this variation of moly coat. I've used that in that application, it's been absolutely fine. That's what I've got on there for now. It's on there as much to stop the little ball bearing rolling around when I disassembled it as anything. You can see the length of that screw. It's the only one like it as far as I know, so just over 15 millimeters, you're not likely to get that mixed up with anything else. But in any case, I will keep that bearing and that plate and that screwdriver together in one little grip lock bag, like so. And with that plate removed, see, this is going to tip now. The reason it's not coming off completely, if you look in this recess where I'm tapping with my finger, there's a spring that's connecting between the plate and a black plastic hook below. So if I unhook that with tweezers, I'll just leave it attached at that end, then this will tip. We can get it off this peg and this peg. If I were to put that back, you see how this black peg here fits into this slot. In 3 recesses, 1, 2, 3, we can see we've got more ball bearings. I haven't added any lubricant to that yet, but I will do. I think it would make sense to keep them in the same little bag as this, you know, everything that pertains to this head assembly plate. I don't know if that's officially what that's called, but that's what I'm referring to when I say that. If I keep all of that together in one little bag, there we go. I could put that and all the cables to do with the heads, the head plate, all together in a larger bag, like that. We can see this mechanism here exposed now. This is the brake that prevents these reels from rolling, creates friction against the side of them. To get that out, we would unhook the spring at one end, then lift off first this one and then this one. So plastic on plastic connection there. We could probably use silicone grease for that. Now let's work at this mechanism, which is to do with pushing the pinch roller back out of the way of the cassette shell when it's not in use. I think it must be this pin here is being turned by one of the cams here in the cam wheel that we looked at earlier. I think that's how that's being achieved. So let's start by disconnecting the 2 springs that are providing that force. It's mostly that one. This one's just an extra bit of tension to keep this part together, I think. But anyway, if I disconnect from the plastic hook there, I'm just tapping with the tweezers, that's where I just disconnected that from, and then I can hook this off at that end. There's a little groove on this pin here to which that attaches. Okay, so that's still moving, but it just stays there when I move it back now. Next thing we need to do is get a little E or C clip here and pull that off. That's it there. And that'll lift up. And it kind of comes out of a slot in this black plastic pin where I'm tapping my finger now. That corresponds to this slot on the metal bar. This part here, I can't see any way to remove that. I think that's just stuck on, you just have to oil it in situ. This does come off. This was covered in the horrible sort of white dust and was completely seized initially. I've been at it with AMS oil and wet dry sandpaper and got that back up to snuff. But there's a C or E clip at the top here. Struggling to get the tweezers into that space. There we go. It's more corroded than the other one, but it is the same size. And then that'll lift off. So I had to put some oil and a rolled up bit of wet dry sandpaper in there to get any of the muck out there. Polished up this post in the same way, and that's now rotating freely on there. But that's how you get that off if you needed to lubricate that. I'm not quite sure yet what this part does, but it's held on with another E or C clip. I keep on saying E or C. I've heard both terms used, so you know, that way it looks almost like a euro sign, but it's also like a capital C nearly with an ornament on it. Anyway, and that lifts off. You could clean that, lubricate it. I'll put these 3 clips and these 3 metal parts, 2 of which have springs attached, all together in one bag, like so. To get all this stuff to do with the reel mechanism out, we don't strictly have to remove these reels, but let's do that first anyway. These are identical and come off in the same way. There's a sort of space here. We can take off a cap that just pushes on with friction. Underneath there, you can see there's a little white washer, and there's another little white washer underneath as well. Can you see where my finger is beside it? I say white, it's a kind of slightly see-through, so, but it's there. There is actually another one in there. Sometimes when it comes away it'll be stuck there, but bear in mind you want to washer this end and this end. These white sprung clips, take them off by pushing in on clips on the other side. That comes away with a spring underneath. So assuming you don't dismantle this, I haven't, I'm just going to leave that like that. If you don't take that apart, then you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 parts per side. Quickly do the same thing here. So I'd keep them in 2 separate bags. This clip that holds the cassette in place, that actually comes out. There's 2 pins you can pull apart here. So there's clips here as well. So 1, 2, 3, 4 clips in total. If we take those out, then this will pull out, so you could clean that separately. This base plate for the idler wheel is held in place with a spring. So the long arms at the top, we pull it out of this pin here, and lift it up, and then basically that shorter arm of it is pushing it up against this pin where I'm tapping here. It would come off like that. At that point, this is just going to slot out, so I could put that in the bag with all the other idler wheel stuff. The only other part that can be removed from this base plate now is this, which is part of the mechanism for opening the door. When we were looking at this rear assembly, I was referring to this rocker arm, which had this little bit that clips onto there like that. It's hard to see there, it's out of focus in the camera, but that's where that's going. I'm not actually going to remove that because it's moving freely and there's no corrosion associated with that. These clips with like 4 prongs, I find that although I can take them on and off, and I do that by just lifting each of these up, and I do that by putting something like the tip of this pair of tweezers under each of those for in turn to loosen them off. When you put them back on, you can never quite get them on as tight as you wanted. We saw this kind of clip on the 2 arms that were part of this assembly, and I really needed to take them off because these parts were seized and I needed to treat and lubricate them. But I don't have that problem here, so I'm not going to remove it, but you could, if you wanted, take these 2 clips off and remove and clean this part of the door opening mechanism. The molybdenum paste that I was mentioning earlier has arrived, so let's reassemble this. Might not be exactly reverse order, but pretty much reverse order from what we've already seen. So, stuff to do with the idler tyre first of all. Turn this the same way up as it was. The spring in, lower pin down, like that. So that's up against that pin, wasn't it? And then as far as there, and then into that space. Put this in, and the spring, plate on top, push that down so the plate intersects with those little plastic clips. Put the washer on top of there. Place the E-clip roughly, and then use needle nose pliers to get it in. Okay. Make sure there's no dust or anything on these spindles. I could put a little bit of moly coat on there. So I'm going to use moly coat for metal to plastic, molybdenum for metal to metal, and silicone grease for plastic to plastic. I mean, in fact, I've used silicone grease for all three of those applications before and it's been fine. Here are all my bits for the spindles. Place the spring inside there. Same on the other side. This one's actually still got one of the washers in it, this one doesn't, so we'll put that in. And these can go on top. Washers on top of there. Push down on these clips. Get the cassette retention clip back in there. And then the rocker arm for the switch that tells it whether the record protection on the cassette is closed or not. That's the screws for the switch that are in that bag. I'll come to that later. Put those screws off to the side. But this is going like that, and then that's going to fit with the shorter arm towards us into that space. Okay. The brakes for the rails, so we'll just rotate these a little bit so there's space for them. Put a little smear of silicone grease on these two pegs. That's absolutely plenty, I would have thought. This one goes below, this one goes on top, so that those pins intersect. This spring into that hole there. Next, let's deal with all the bits to do with the pinch roller arm. So we've got our 3 E-clips here. This part went in here. Drop the E-clip into position, use needle nose pliers to have it engage like that. Because that's metal on metal, then I'll probably should have done that first, but I can't see any harm in putting this molybdenum paste in there afterwards. I'm just going to put a spot of the molybdenum, this part here. I guess this arm is going to just travel along on the plastic, so I won't add any parts there. I will put some molybdenum on this shaft here though, because that's a metal to metal connection there. That E-clip on, tighten it with the needle nose pliers from this end. This is slotting plastic to metal there, but metal to metal in there, which is where I put the paste. I could also put some molybdenum here, so that's because that's going to be a metal to metal connection. Place that E-clip on. Yeah, that's it on there. This tension spring is going onto a groove on that peg that I just tapped. I might need pliers for that. There we go. Then this one's hooking for the black plastic clip here. And that's that working now. before we put the plate on. These areas are where the little bearings will go. Because it's metal on plastic, I'm going to use the Molycoat EM30L synthetic grease. Put a dab of them in each of those recesses. And also around this peg where it's going to be holding up against the metal plate. Got all my bits in this little bag here. These bearings have still got paste on them, so they just stick to the surface of my finger. And place them into the holes. Then this plate, to make sure I get that underneath this pinch roller arm. Okay. And that's rolling along there. I can hook this little spring here onto the black plastic plate below. That was my 5th attempt. I'll edit the previous ones out. Not so easy, but at that point that's going to roll back and forth like that. And the final one of these, I'll stick in that space there with Molycoat. Maybe add a little bit more on top, just to be sure. That will go on there with this little black peg by my fingernail. Going through that hole, meaning we can screw in this long screw here. Tighten that as far down as it will go. So that's on there securely now. I'll put a tiny dab of Molycoat onto that shaft where the pinch roller is going. I really don't want too much there because I don't really want any of it to get onto the pinch roller itself and therefore onto the tape where it could interfere with the recording in any way. And I want my hands to be pretty clean before I handle the pinch roller here, so I just wipe them on an isopropyl wipe just off the screen there. Put that down, washer on top, C-clip on top of there, E-clip, whichever you're calling it. Clip it into place, needle nose pliers. I'm going to reattach the real motor before I put the switch on there so that the record enable switch doesn't get damaged by the weight of this. It's attached to these optical sensors, which is why I'm not putting them on yet. If you'll remember, the shielding for this motor was corroded, so I've got a couple of extra bits of shielding from some old Mabuchi motors from Tascams. And I'll just wrap some duct tape around there so it doesn't come loose. Seems like one of my cohabitants has nicked my duct tape, I can't find it, so I've put this shielding tape on, but anyway that's going to hold that in place. On the back we want to place the motor this way round. If we placed it that way round it would interfere with the space needed for the switch and so on. From this side we just want to get it so the holes for the screws line up roughly. Tighten both of those. Now the weight of the mechanism is resting harmlessly on the back of the motor. We can refit this harness that has the counter sensors and the record enable switch on it. So I'm going to screw down the higher of these two sensors first. And then this one will just slot into place. Held in there with clips. You push these cables down into this tidy. Now if I turn this over again, then we can place this plate in such a way that the little plastic protrusions on these two standing posts slot into the metal. When we do that we want to ensure that the switch is below this rocker arm. Like that, so that the rocker arm would close the switch here. Then we can insert the two screws that we set aside earlier. It's probably going to be slightly out of focus. You can see that provided the cassette protection tab is still present, then when the cassette is inserted that'll shut that switch, which will enable the record circuit. That's the front part of the Mecha block all in one bit. Let's reassemble the rear part. So in reassembling this rear section, the first thing I'm going to want to do is apply the molybdenum paste. I want to get it into this nook here. Now I don't suppose it really matters that it's on these parts here, white parts, but I'll wipe the excess off anyway. Might be for plastic to plastic connection there, we want silicone grease for that. On there and guide it around. I'm also applying the black moly paste to the shaft here. The silicone paste will get onto this cog, so on the potentiometer, just by contact with that one. It also says in the service manual that we want some of this paste on these indented areas. Now you recall from earlier, we want this line across here to line up with that mark there. And then when we insert this one, there's a little marker here that we want to line up with that there, and we want to get that to go down without disturbing that too much, so that relationship should be correct now. So I can take this clip and force it down into position. Probably what I'll do to achieve that is push it down with a flathead screwdriver until it goes into that slot. It's pretty strong, but I will just check that it's tight with needle nose pliers. Give that a turn so the silicone grease is transferred between those two cogs. I'm not sure whether it's important, but I'm going to just put that marker back to that notch before turning this over and replacing the two arms on here. So there's this one that is for opening the door. So I want to make sure that that part, and I could just dip that in the black moly, is going into that slot there, yeah. So it should be that when that cog turns, that arm is being moved. With that in place, I can slot this 4-pin retainer clip down there, and I want to make sure that that's engaging properly, so push down all 4 of these pins. Flathead screwdriver. I want that to be tight enough so it won't come out again. And what I maybe forgot to do there was just put some black moly on that pin, because that's a metal to metal connection. Yeah, that was treated with oil earlier, so I think that's probably going to be fine, but if you're doing it, put some black moly on there as well, I would think. And likewise I'm going to put some onto this post here and fit that so that metal pin is going against the edge of the white cog there. Push this clip down, make sure all 4 of these pins are engaging. That's on pretty firmly. Next we want to insert this in here and put this flywheel through here. Metal on metal surface there, I'm going to put just a little bit of the black moly just here so it doesn't pass through onto the capstan pin, which I would clean again after inserting this through anyway, but just to be safe. So we've got black moly up to about there. Put that through there. These 3 holes are going to line up to these 3 posts. Now we can put the 2 halves together. The capstan pin is going to go through this hole here. The centre, this part here, is going to go through that hole. We want this peg to be between these 2 markers here, so that this clip is going to join up with this part of the door mechanism here. Then these 2 brass recesses for screws are going to go in these 2 holes, and this brass hole is going to go here. So let's slot those through those 2 holes first. Get the brass parts more or less lined up, and check that the plastic clip is going into that recess there. Okay, and we can add these 3 screws, which were a different length to anything else, back on, ensuring that this clip, which is giving electrical continuity between the heads and this chassis, between the screw and the chassis at that point. Before I put this last screw in, just noticed that there's this recess for these cables that I forgot about, so clearly this yellow one for this optical sensor shouldn't be in this cable tidy, I don't think. I think it just comes round like that. Otherwise we won't be able to get the black plates of the door mechanism on in a minute. Anyway, we can get this last screw in, and the two halves of this are firmly joined together again. If you're observant, you may have noticed that I've actually repaired this. This got a little bit twisted in all the handling I've done and trying to suss it out, but that's been resoldered again. So I guess next we want to get these parts and this fresh belt back on there. I didn't order this belt, so I don't know exactly what the dimensions of it are. Let's have a look. I'm going to say that the folded length of that is 17mm and 2mm wide, square. I'm in the UK, I would get that from gbaudio.co.uk. Your local supplier is going to vary depending where you live in the world, so I really need you to look at forums and so on for that, unfortunately. So I'm going to put a little bit more moly coat on there for inserting this onto there and fitting the belt around this wheel and pulley. I've got this metal plate flipped the wrong way around. I'll just go off screen and fix that. Okay, I flipped that plate around. It just involved taking those 3 screws off and unscrewing these 4 screws and then flipping that around 180 degrees. That allows me to put this in place. I've placed it such that the teeth at the end of this wheel engage with, you see the cog where my finger's tapping? It's moving in response to that. So at one end of the range of motion, which is dictated by how far this pop can turn, the heads are inserted into the cassette shell and the pinch roller is touching the capstan. But you see, if I reproduce what this motor is doing and turn this cog in the other way, head array lowers. And if I keep going, see how the door opening mechanism moves. Lowers the heads and the pinch roller first, then see, this has started to lower. That would open the door. Okay. I had to do a little bit of adjustment to this switch in order to get this plastic plate to go back on. Basically I had to turn around this rocket arm and then slightly bend the leaf switch so that when that's raised, that switch is now closed, which I think is the correct behaviour. That beeping is because I've got continuity meter hooked up to the right pins. So now it should be when the cassette goes in, that is closed. But without having turned this plastic part around this plate that holds on with 2 clips, and there, slots in here and here, pins go through those holes. That didn't want to go in until I made that adjustment. 2 minor adjustments have been made off screen. One is that I've put this zip tie to keep this cable and this one that shares the same header, which leads to the record enable switch, a bit more tidy. These two are getting strung through this little aperture here just to make space for the plates that keep the door mechanism going back on. The other adjustment is that I didn't actually have this plate going into the right slot underneath here. It was sitting on top of there, so when I did a dry run of putting the door mechanism back on, the plate was actually preventing the head array from raising. So we want to make sure, as well as this little peg here needs to go through that hole, both of these slots go behind these 2 pins where my fingernails are. That requires a certain amount of fiddling to achieve, but there we go, like that, and then that should push behind those clips and we're good to go. So I'm going to recommend that you put on this plate, which goes at this side closest to the flywheel of the direct drive motor first. So I'm going to take one of the little plastic inserts, push it into this hole here, and it's going to slide along there. That's a moving part, so I'll add a little bit of white moly there as well. Make sure that that mechanism is going to move nice and smoothly. And then line up these 2 screw holes with these 2 holes. 1, 2. Sorry, that's probably out of focus. So I'll put these screws in by hand to begin with. Tighten them up with the screwdriver. And now that little washer, it can't get back into that hole, so it's stuck in there now. Then for this side, let's stick all the stuff back on. Something I didn't notice before is that this part that we removed actually comes in 2 parts. So I've put some silicone grease in there. So what we want is there's a little plastic peg here that's going to fit into this hole beside my fingernail, while this pin goes through the centre of that part. I'm going to suggest that you put this spring in first. We want the long side, the longer part of this spring, to be underneath here. And it's going to go into the second hole, so we can put it in like that. Once it's in, swivel it round. Providing the peg on the bottom of it goes into that hole that I just mentioned. Part of this peg with the groove should protrude, and we can put the C-clip on it. Slide that most of the way into place, and then clip it on with needle nose pliers. I'll move that out the way slightly for now because we're going to put this switch on. That should go that way up. And we've got these screws that are going to go into these holes underneath. You can see now that when this goes past here, it's shutting this switch. I'm not exactly sure what that switch does, but it must be important, or they wouldn't have included it. So with the main Mecha block like that, this hole here is engaging with this peg, and then this plastic peg on the larger part should be going through the washer. And just turn that so you can see it a bit clearer in the light, where I'm tapping my finger now. We also want this arm to be as low as it will go, so if you're all lubed up properly, you should be able to manually turn the mechanism. So I'm pulling that cog towards me and it raises this, but if I push that cog away from me, it lowers it. I want that to be pretty much as low as it'll go. That becomes important for fitting this spring in a second. So we want to be positioned like this, these cables back and out of the way, and we want to get this peg here going into this hole, and we want to get this peg to go through that part and into this. So I'm going to put a little bit of the white moly on there. Can wipe up the excess in a second. So put some on there. No, for the metal on metal connection there, you could probably use the black moly, but I think the white moly is probably good enough for that as well. I know this looks rough, but I will clean it up after doing it. And this is fiddly. I would put the screws in, maybe not tightly, but at least halfway in, and you should have this kind of movement where this peg where I'm tapping is engaged, this peg where I'm tapping is engaged, this one's in there, that one's in there. Okay, so at that point you're good to tighten these screws up. Now we want to hook this spring onto that peg that's part of the plastic sliding mechanism. It's engaged with this rocker arm here. That's why we wanted that arm down, to make putting that on simple enough. Now it should be that if I again rotate this by hand, see the okay, the assembly is down and the door is up, and then if I rotate it in the other direction, first the door closes and then the head assembly raises. Before you put anything else back on, I would suggest that you test that with a cassette in. So I'm going to pop this cassette into the door, rotating by hand again, and it should sit into place like that, and then when you continue, the pinch roller and the heads go into the cassette shell. I've just spotted that we do actually have some partly broken teeth to the gear in there. That'll be accounting for the noise. It does seem to be working, just noisy. I'll get some more grease in between the connection between this wheel and this cog here, and that'll minimise any kind of friction, prevent any further damage, but that's why that's making that slightly clicking noise. But I don't think that changes any of the instructions that I've shown you. Putting the brackets on, I'm starting off with the real motor and the capstan motor closer to me. This is going to stick off to that side a bit more, and the smaller of these holes should line up with these two holes here, roughly like that. And these are the screws with the sort of flatter head from the teardown. Just getting the thread to bite by hand before tightening them up with a screwdriver. It's going to look something like that. Then on this side, it's the larger of these holes, the inside pair. It's going to line up with these two holes on the chassis. And we've got the larger domed head on the screws. Again, I'll get the ferrule to bite by hand before tightening up with a screwdriver. We've got these metal brackets with the heads closest to me. I'm having these recesses farther away from the head. These cables for the heads are going to go through a channel here, so I'm going to add another zip tie there just to keep that organised. It's worth noticing as well that I've got the cables that are coming from the head strung through this little aperture in this plate here, so that's keeping all the cables together but still allowing screws to pass through here, and then the cable's going to come down onto the record playback boards at the right point. Now these two holes are part of how this whole Mecha block attaches to the chassis of the rest of the unit, so I don't need to screw anything on there, but this one's really just extra stability, I think, so I can join that to these brackets, screws here and here. It's these 2 points which I'm touching with my forefinger and thumb which are used to attach the Mecha block to the rest of the unit at this end. Final detail is to put the plastic cover on the door. In the beginning of the teardown video I wasn't sure how to do that, but there's just little pegs here. They go into that space there, and you just push up, and that's it, attached. I can't see any screws or anything that put that on any more tightly. That's it, I think. I hope you found that helpful. Thanks for watching. See you again soon.